Human body is organized, and it's organized by its anatomy and physiology, right? So if we think about the form, and then how the form affects the function, and then all these functions work together to make us, right? So the organization of the human body. On these next couple of slides, I'm going to go through a couple things, and then um, look at some pictures of what we're talking about. So the organization of the human body. Um, So I can divide the body into two main parts, the appendicular portion and the axial portion. If you ever heard the word appendages, appendages are referred to as your arms and legs. So the appendicular portion of the body would be your upper and lower limbs or your arms and your legs. That is a kind of a simple breakdown of it. It'll get a lot more complex when we get to the muscular system and the skeletal system. The axial portion is basically everything else, your head, your neck, and your trunk. If you think of your trunk, it's basically this area in the middle of the body from our hips up to our neck. Okay. Um, and that's what our legs and our arms attach to. Our legs and our arms attached to our trunk. Now, there's a lot of parts of the axial portion of the body, and we're going to break them into cavities. Now, within each of these cavities contain a bunch of stuff. So first and foremost, I can look at ventral cavities. Actually, let me go back one. I can look at ventral and then dorsal cavities. Ventral meaning towards the front, dorsal meaning towards the back of my body. So the ventral cavities that we're going to look at. Two main ones are the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. The thoracic cavity is in your chest, your rib cage, and it's hard. I'm used to teaching in front of a class and pointing at things, but your rib cage called your thoracic cage. So the cavity inside your rib cage is your thoracic cavity, right? So what do we find in our thoracic cavity? I find my lungs, my heart, my trachea, my esophagus. All that stuff is within the thoracic cavity. Now, I can divide the thoracic cavity into three different things. I have a right and a left pleural cavity. Excuse me, a right and a left pleural cavity. The pleural cavities is where you have your lungs. And then I have something called a mediastinum right in the middle of the chest. That's where the heart, trachea, and esophagus are going to travel. Okay. And that's what I just said there. And thymus gland, excuse me. Your abdominopelvic cavity, let's break that word down. Abdomen, right? Probably have heard that word. And then pelvis. Pelvis is basically around your hips. So your abdominopelvic cavity is basically everything below the diaphragm. If you're not sure where the diaphragm is, it's this big muscle basically at the bottom of your rib cage that separates the abdominopelvic cavity from the thoracic cavity. We're going to see pictures of that in a minute. So I can break this down into quadrants, and we'll get more into that while we're in class. Abdominal cavity contains a bunch of stuff. Okay, if you can think of all of your, let me back up. If I ask you to name an organ, most likely you guys are going to tell me an organ that's in the abdominal cavity. Stomach, liver, spleen, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, at least most of it. All of these things, kidneys, are in the abdominal cavity. So that's the upper portion of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Then I can take the abdominal cavity and I can divide it into these regions. So basically, I'm going to draw a little grid, and you're going to see these regions in the abdominal cavity, and we'll come back to that when we see a picture. The pelvic cavity is the lower part. So the pelvic cavity is going to contain our reproductive organs, our urinary bladder, in the lower portion of our large intestine. Now, the dorsal cavities, we're thinking towards the back. So my cranial cavity, which contains my brain, and then my spinal cavity, which is going to contain my spinal cord. So those are more towards the back portion of the body. So let's look at some pictures here. So I have the axial skeleton on the left. I have the axial skeleton in the blue there. Then on the right in the blue, I have the appendicular skeleton. Notice how the appendicular skeleton contains like the hip bones. Also, if you've heard of the scapula and the clavicle, those are part of the appendicular skeleton. And then this whole central region right here is the axial skeleton. So let's look at the cavities. Well, here's the breakdown of it. All the stuff in yellow are my dorsal cavities, dorsal body cavities. So I have the cranial cavity. I'll just do this cranial cavity, and then the vertebral cavity or spinal cavity going right here. And then all this stuff in red are my ventral cavities. And we're going to do a lot of talking about these things. So thoracic cavity here and here, right? So that all of these little breakdowns are the part of the thoracic cavity. Now within the thoracic cavity, I have a pleural cavity on either side. Then I have the mediastinum, and actually they're breaking it down to the pericardial cavity, which is good. That contains the heart, but that's part of the mediastinum as well. The diaphragm goes right across the middle of this, dividing these two cavities up. So you can see that here and here. And then below the diaphragm, I have the abdominopelvic cavity. So the abdominopelvic cavity comes all the way down here, and it contains two parts, the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. So this little section here within the hip bones is the pelvic cavity, and this big section containing your abdomen, that's where you're going to find your stomach, liver, gallbladder, spleen, small intestine, all those things are in the abdominal cavity. So there's a little breakdown of all the cavities that we will study and take a look at. Now within these things, we have stuff called viscera. Viscera are the organs of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so your heart is a viscera, your lungs are viscera, your liver is viscera. Okay, viscera are the organs within these cavities. The diaphragm separates the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. But then we have some other cavities in our head. Okay, so I already told you about the cranial cavity, but then I have these guys here. I have the oral cavity, which would be your nose, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute. Excuse me, not. Let me back up. Your nasal cavity is your nose. Your oral cavity is in your mouth that contains your teeth and tongue. Your orbital cavities are going to contain your eyes and the nerves associated in there. And then your middle ear cavity is going to contain these tiny itty bitty bones and receptors that allow you to hear. So here's a little picture of what we're looking at there. We also have these things called sinuses. If you ever had a sinus headache, that's kind of an inflammation of the sinuses inside your head. But I have the cranial cavity right here that contains the brain. I have a bunch of sinuses. Middle ear cavity, it goes way down deep in there. We'll talk a little bit about the bones of the middle ear later in the year. Orbital contains the eyes. Nasal cavity, that's the nose or this nose passage, nasal passage, and then the oral cavity where you're eating. So that is the organization of the cavities within the human body, and we will talk about membranes on the next video.